Meghan is not coming to the UK. After months of buildup and the leaks about the emotional distance closing, the speculation about conditions and timings, the carefully managed mood music about a grand return to British soil after 4 years away, the hints about visiting Diana's grave, which landed as a genuinely touching gesture to some people and as an oddly convenient piece of press management to others, she is staying in California while Harry goes to Birmingham alone for the Invictus Games.
Their problem is that they've got no future. I mean, as ever, all her products, of course, is a complete disaster. She's got no Netflix series. She hasn't got any project at all. And they are literally wallowing in, in sort of in a maze where to go. And so predictably. And so that is the problem. And for them to come back in the midst of the current royal crisis here.
And the reason it unraveled is genuinely interesting because it tells you something much more specific about where this couple actually sits right now than anything a spokesperson has said publicly. The security decision is where Tom Bower places the immediate trigger. Harry submitted a request to RAVEC, the Royal and VIP Executive Committee, which is the body responsible for assessing and approving security arrangements for royals and high-profile public figures visiting the UK, asking for government-funded armed protection for himself and his family for the duration of the trip. This is not a new request. This is the same argument he has been making for years, the same principle he took all the way to court and lost, the same position he has repeatedly and publicly attached to the question of whether his family will set foot in Britain at all.
A shocking headline on the front page of the Mail on Sunday. Dismay for the King as Harry says he may not bring Meghan and the kids back to the UK.
He has said explicitly in multiple interviews, in clearly stated terms, that he will not bring Meghan and the children to the UK without the same security level provided to working members of the royal family. The argument being that threats against them did not disappear when they stepped back from royal duties. Only the protection did. According to Bower, the security request was denied again, and when it was denied, the trip as Harry and Meghan had apparently been planning it came apart. Not because the denial was unexpected. He has been denied before, has been through the court process, has understood for years that this particular battle is not going his way through official channels. But because the denial apparently arrived close enough to the trip that it forced a decision Harry had perhaps been hoping to avoid, which was whether to come alone or not come at all.
She is very calculating and very ruthless and very self-promoting, but she's taken on more in the end than she can chew.
Now here is where it gets interesting, because the security denial is the obvious headline and the one that will be used to explain the decision in most of the coverage, but it is not really the whole story. The security denial is the thing that forced the decision. The whole story is everything that was waiting underneath it, everything that would have made the trip difficult and contested even if the security had been granted. Think about what Meghan was actually returning to, and be specific about it rather than just saying it was complicated, because the specifics are where the real story lives. Not to a royal residence, Frogmore Cottage is gone. They no longer have an official base in the UK, having been asked to leave it and having done so without the kind of public acknowledgement that allowed them to frame it on their own terms.
I think that's what the Invictus Games, which is this very splendid competition for wounded servicemen, is going to start in Birmingham next year, but there's a rehearsal later in the summer. And Harry is determined to come, and if he could, he'd bring Meghan and somehow work his way back in, so that they have status.
Not to warm relationships with palace staff, many of whom have reportedly never made peace with her. The bullying allegations never having been resolved to anyone's satisfaction on either side of them. Not to a British media landscape that has been waiting 4 years for the return visit with everything it means for circulation and clicks, and the chance to write again about the couple who left. And not to a public that has been consistently ranking her among the most unpopular public figures in British opinion polling for years running, not because of any single incident, but because of the accumulated weight of everything that has come before this moment. Bower's framing of this is direct, and I think it is right. She would not receive the warm welcome that a member of the royal family normally expects. Not because anyone would threaten her or be openly hostile. This is not that kind of institution. But because the relationships within the institution have not been repaired, the institution itself has not done anything resembling forgiving. And the welcome that Meghan apparently imagined for this trip does not exist in the form she needed it to take.
Prince Harry and Meghan could be staying at Althorp House, Princess Diana's ancestral estate, in West Northamptonshire. I feel very British. They're going to be staying in West Northamptonshire, having high tea and crumpets and scones. The estate's website notes that it will be closed to visitors next month, prompting speculation that Harry and his family could visit or even stay there during the family trip. Now, this is where Princess Diana is buried, and with the family's visit falling shortly after her birthday, this could make sense. Her birthday is on July 1st.
The version of a UK visit that would have been worth having for her. The one that rebuilds relevance, generates the right kind of coverage, offers a platform for the lifestyle brand, produces the visual of a couple still meaningfully connected to the most powerful family in Britain. That version required the security, required an official royal residence, required a warmth from the institution that currently nobody inside it is extending, and required William to not immediately and publicly put distance between his household and whatever content she tried to generate from wherever she was staying. Without all of those things being true simultaneously, coming back was never going to produce the redemptive narrative arc she needed. It was always going to be a difficult, contested, heavily covered return that reopened every unresolved question, reminded every viewer of everything that has been said and done, put her in front of cameras that would ask the questions she least wants to answer, and left her in a measurably worse position than staying put in California. That is the calculation, and once you lay it out that way, the decision to stay home starts to look less like a defeat and considerably more like the only rational choice available in a situation where none of the good options existed.
Absolutely. I mean, the cost of living for them is enormous. I mean, the security alone, which they feel they need, must cost between $1.5 and $2 million a year.
There is another dimension to this that I think gets underweighted in most of the coverage. And it is the question of whether Harry and Meghan actually want the same thing from this situation. Because from the available evidence, they may not. And the gap between those wants is becoming increasingly visible in how this trip has played out. Harry, by every credible read of his behavior over the last 2 years, wants the relationship with his father to exist in some real form before his father's health situation closes that window entirely. He has lived through the specific experience of losing a parent while the relationship was still unresolved, before the conversations happened, before the repair was attempted, and everything about how he talks about his father's illness suggests he does not want to go through that again. He also appears to want some kind of genuine, maintained connection to the country he came from, to the veterans who represent his most credible and least contested public purpose, to the institution that formed him, however complicated and painful his relationship with it has become.
That's why I trust the process. RAVEC, who did deny Harry this additional security that he's requested, it's their job to assess credible threats using intelligence the public doesn't have access to. And if they concluded Harry doesn't require the level of taxpayer-funded security he's demanding, I have to assume that decision was based on the best available evidence.
There is something in his consistent public behavior around UK visits. The way he keeps going back, keeps maintaining the Invictus presence, keeps trying to find conditions for a meeting with his father. That speaks to someone who has not fully made peace with the distance. Meghan, by the available evidence, wants to return to the UK on terms that restore her relevance and standing as a public figure, not as a private person visiting family, but as someone whose return signals that the institution acknowledges her importance and that the lifestyle brand benefits from the association. That is a categorically different thing from what Harry appears to want from the situation, and it requires categorically different conditions. Conditions that would require William to cooperate, the institution to extend warmth it currently does not feel, and the UK media environment to somehow produce coverage that the Sussex operation would find acceptable, none of which the institution has any intention of facilitating.
On the other hand, William, under no circumstances, in my opinion, would allow Harry to come back, and Meghan would be certainly stopped midway across the Atlantic.
Harry's version of a UK visit can potentially happen within the parameters that currently exist. Charles seeing his son, the Invictus event, something that resembles a family connection even in limited form. Meghan's version requires the institution to extend warmth, access, and commercial opportunity that nobody inside it has any intention of extending. That divergence in what each of them needs from this situation explains a great deal about why this trip ended the way it did. and why it was probably always going to be harder to execute than the early optimistic leaks and the carefully managed mood music suggested.
There's a whole story about her attitude to people she works with, especially in a photo shoot about Reitman's, a sort of Marks and Spencer's chain store in Canada, where the experience for all the 80 crew was just horrendous. And there was an agent who told, two agents who told horrible stories about her bullying and her oppression. That was really quite a revelation.
Subscribe to Palace Insider so you never miss what we cover next. The like button genuinely costs you nothing, and it is the single most useful thing you can do to help this channel reach people who want this kind of analysis rather than the sanitized version. Now let's talk about what Harry going alone actually means, because I think this is the most underreported dimension of the whole story, and the one that reveals the most about where things actually stand between these two people, and between Harry and his family. Harry going to Birmingham for Invictus without Meghan and without the children is, on the surface, a practical decision made necessary by a security denial. But it is also a public picture.
And people on the whole are bored to death with her and her jam and her silly speeches and ridiculous shots on Instagram, and suddenly becomes an irritating irrelevance. And that is really, I think, in her darkest moments, her greatest fear. What happens when the show stops completely because the world is not interested?
Harry in the UK, at his own event, without his family beside him. And that picture looks different from everything the Sussex operation has presented for the last 5 years. The inseparable couple, the two of us against the institution, the united front that every joint Sussex appearance has been built to project. Harry alone in Birmingham does not produce that visual. It produces something much less managed, and potentially something much more significant. If Harry has any time with his father during this trip, even briefly, even a short conversation in a room with just the two of them and nobody else sitting in, it will happen without Meghan present. And that matters considerably more than it might sound, because every account of why the relationship between Harry and his father has been so difficult to repair in recent years places the question of Meghan's presence, and what happens to information shared when she is in the room, at the center of the difficulty. A meeting where Meghan is not there is a meeting that runs on completely different terms. Terms where the principal anxiety about information ending up in commercial content, which has reportedly been one of the central reasons Charles has been cautious about what he says and how available he makes himself, might be somewhat reduced. It will be a father and son talking to each other without the presence of the person who has been positioned, fairly or not, as a central figure in the breakdown of that relationship. Charles has reportedly been open to seeing Harry. The question has always been under what conditions and what happens afterward. A meeting where none of the material ends up in a book, a podcast, a Netflix segment, or a briefing to a sympathetic journalist. That would be a different kind of meeting from anything the last several years have produced. Tom Bower has made this argument before in various forms, and he makes it again here. Harry understands on some level that the UK is where his family is, where his father is, where his roots are, and that whatever future version of himself has any real standing in the British public consciousness requires some kind of connection to that ground. Connection that is separate from Meghan, separate from the Sussex commercial brand, and that is just Harry and the country and the family he came from and the veterans who have always represented the best version of what his post-royal life could have been. Whether that version of Harry is actually retrievable at this point is a separate and much harder question. 5 years of public warfare have done specific and traceable damage to specific relationships. The memoir is still in print. The Netflix documentary is still streaming. The Oprah interview exists permanently and has been seen by more people than any public statement or reconciliation gesture could reach. None of that disappears because Harry shows up in Birmingham without his wife. But something changes in the picture when he shows up without her. And the question is whether that change is enough of an opening for anything meaningful to happen through it. Bower's overall commercial assessment of where the Sussex operation sits right now is worth dwelling on for a moment, because he has been right about enough of this story that I take his read seriously rather than dismissing it because it points somewhere uncomfortable. Every revenue stream that was supposed to make Sussex independence sustainable has come under serious pressure at roughly the same time. Netflix restructured and ended. Spotify ended with its executive using language that made headlines of its own. Speaking fees have contracted significantly by multiple credible industry reports. The As Ever brand has seen its traffic drop sharply from its launch numbers. The podcast underperformed badly enough to fall off the charts before anyone had to officially acknowledge it, and the Archewell Foundation had a documented deficit in its most recent public filings. These are not individual bad luck stories that happen to cluster together in an unfortunate season. They are a pattern describing the commercial contraction of an operation that was built on a specific kind of institutional proximity and cultural novelty, both of which have been fading simultaneously, and is now discovering what happens to a brand when the thing that gave it its value starts to disappear. Bower's argument is that eventually the pressure of that contraction will become irresistible, and that when it does, Harry will look toward the UK, not because anything has been fixed, but because there is nowhere else left to look. That may be a harsh read, and I want to be fair about it. Commercial operations have difficult periods that they recover from, and 2 years of contraction does not necessarily mean permanent decline, but the trajectory is real, and the pattern across multiple revenue streams simultaneously is the kind of thing that is difficult to attribute purely to external factors. Now, the accommodation question, because Bower mentions it, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets in this conversation. Reports suggested that King Charles could arrange somewhere for Harry to stay during the visit, which would be a significant gesture from a father toward a son. But the implication of the reporting is that the accommodation being offered was not what Meghan wanted, not in terms of physical comfort, but in terms of what it would communicate about their status and their standing within the institution. Because here's the thing about where the Sussex commercial operation has positioned itself over the last several years, and this is the part that most coverage of the accommodation question misses entirely. The brand depends on proximity to the crown, not just for the titles and the names on the products, but for the visual language of belonging that gives those products their premium positioning. Not just on the titles, on the visual of institutional belonging, on footage inside royal spaces, on the implicit endorsement that comes from being seen to be welcome within the family. That is the commercial ingredient that makes everything else in the Sussex portfolio more valuable than it would be without it. The jam, the wine, the candles, the lifestyle brand, the documentary deals, the memoir. All of it draws its premium price from the association with the British monarchy, and specifically from the appearance that the association is warm and ongoing rather than formal and contested. If Harry and Meghan come to the UK and stay somewhere that clearly signals they are visitors rather than family, somewhere that does not provide the photographic backdrop of an institution that still welcomes them, then the commercial purpose of the trip has already failed before they step off the plane. Bower's point, and I think it is right, is that William would not have permitted them to use any palace space as a backdrop for content production, would not have allowed the filmed in a royal setting moment that the lifestyle brand would obviously have wanted to create. Without official accommodation, without access to the visual language of belonging, the trip becomes commercially useless for the Sussex operation even before you factor in the hostile media environment and the unrepaired relationships. Royal critics have framed this as Meghan refusing to return unless she can come back in a role that resembles what she had. The recognition, the institutional standing, the commercial platform, the warmth. And while that framing is reductive and does not capture the full complexity, it contains something real that is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. What she apparently needs from a UK trip is the visual evidence that she still matters to the institution and that the institution still acknowledges her. Without that, it is just a difficult media cycle in an expensive hotel, and the cost-benefit calculation does not work out. Let me stay with the broader picture that Bower's analysis points toward, because I think it deserves direct attention, rather than just being used as color around the specific trip story. Because what he is describing is not about one canceled visit, it is about a trajectory. He is not saying the trip failed because of a single security denial. He is saying the trip failed because the Sussex operation has been trying to return on terms the institution simply will not meet, and that gap between the terms they want and the terms available to them is not closing. It is widening. Every condition Meghan would need met for a return to be worth having: the security, the residence, the warmth from the family, the commercial opportunity, William's implicit cooperation. Those conditions are either formally unavailable, like the security, or informally unavailable, like William's cooperation, or physically unavailable, like the Frogmore residence that no longer belongs to them. None of those things is moving toward them. They are all moving in the other direction. The institution is not offering nothing. It is offering something. It is offering Charles seeing his son privately, without cameras, without conditions attached to the visit that would be useful to the Sussex commercial operation, without the framework of a brand event wrapped around a family meeting. It is offering a relationship between a father and a son on the institution's terms, which means quietly, without the cameras, without commercial leverage built into the terms of access, and without any element that could later appear in a memoir or a Netflix segment, which is, in one sense, the only offer worth having. But it is also the offer that requires setting down everything the Sussex operation has been built around, and it is not clear that anyone in that operation has decided they are ready to do that. The Diana's grave detail, which appeared in reporting before the trip fell apart, is worth noting because it says something about what the trip was supposed to be in the public narrative and how carefully it was being managed from the communication side. Visiting Princess Diana's grave is a genuinely moving gesture when it is private and quiet. When it is announced to journalists in advance of a trip that has significant commercial and reputational stakes, it functions differently. It gives the trip an emotional anchor that makes it harder to criticize and provides a narrative frame that puts the coverage on softer ground. I am not saying the intention was not genuine, because I genuinely do not know. But I am saying that a detail like that does not make it into the press unless someone decided it should make it into the press. And the decision to make it public tells you something about how the trip was being managed from a communications perspective before it fell apart. Here is where I end up with this, and it connects to something Bower says that I think is the most important sentence in his analysis. He believes Harry knows, somewhere underneath all the noise, all the statements, all the carefully managed distance that has been maintained now for several years, that the UK might eventually be the only place left, and that whatever thread of connection remains to his father and his country and his family is worth holding on to even when the conditions make it difficult. That whatever relationship he can still salvage with his father, whatever thread of connection remains with the country and the institution, is worth holding on to because when everything else has run its course, that is what will still be there. That belief, if it is real, and I think there is more evidence for it than there is against it, is what keeps Harry choosing to go to Birmingham even when the conditions fall short of what he said he needed, even when Meghan is staying home, even when everything about the trip carries some level of risk and nothing about it is entirely straightforward. He is going anyway, alone, back to the country where his family is, where his father is, where his roots are, where the veterans who are the most defensible and least contested version of his post-royal purpose are gathering, without the taxpayer-funded security he asked for, without the level of protection he has publicly said he needs, without the official residence that would signal institutional belonging, and without Meghan, which changes the visual and the dynamic of the trip in ways that nobody in the Sussex operation seems to have fully accounted for in advance. That is the story underneath the cancelled trip. The security denial is the headline, but the geography of what Harry and Meghan each actually need from a UK visit is the reason the trip was always going to be difficult to pull off in a form that worked for both of them. What do you make of all of this? Do you think Harry going alone to Birmingham actually opens anything meaningful with his father? Or does the combination of the security situation and William's position make any real progress essentially impossible regardless of what Harry does? And do you think the divergence I described between what Harry wants and what Meghan wants from this situation is real, or am I reading too much into limited evidence? Drop it in the comments, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.